Hello again, everybody. October proved to be a very tumultuous month for me at the University of Arizona, so I have another makeup lecture here for my personal morality course. This was an essay called Consent is Not Enough by David McPherson. It's about the role of consent in sexual relationships and the value of sexual relationships more generally. It's an interesting essay. It gets at some questions about what makes relationships valuable and what moral obligations we might have in relation to them. As I'll discuss, I'm not sure that everything that McPherson says, especially about universities and their promotion of consent in sexual relationships, I'm not sure all that stuff is exactly right, but let's get into it, see what he says, think about it. I want to start by just kind of laying out the main claims that McPherson is looking to defend. These all come up at the very beginning of the essay. There's no real mystery here. First, McPherson argues that the consent-only model of sexual ethics affirms a casual view of sex that cannot make sense of or properly combat sexual violence. So McPherson thinks there is something distinctly bad about sexual violence, but that consent-only approaches to sexual ethics can't really make sense of that idea, and that they may, has kind of an interesting argument that he says that they actually contribute to the problem. Second, the consent-only model of sexual ethics fails to recognize what is special and significant about human sexuality, and it can't properly support committed, erotic, loving relationships. So the idea here is that by emphasizing that consent is the only really important ingredient in relationships, this makes it more likely that we'll engage in sort of frivolous or almost business-like sexual relationships rather than trying to find stable monogamous relationships. And McPherson views that as a bad thing. And the traditional sexual ethic, this is the third claim that McPherson is trying to defend. The traditional sexual ethic, traditional is sort of his gloss on it. There are some ways in which I think the ethic he lays out is compatible with some more modern notions of sexual ethics, but I'll flag those later. But the third claim he's trying to defend is the traditional sexual ethic fares better than the consent-only model regarding items 1 and 2 on this list. So he thinks the traditional sexual ethic can do better at explaining what's bad about sexual violence and does a better job of promoting committed, erotic, loving relationships. So what exactly is this consent-only model? Well, McPherson suggests it is perhaps best understood as a sort of liberal, again this is his term, liberal sexual ethic. This is the kind of sexual ethic he thinks is being promoted in various contexts by universities and other, perhaps other organizations that promote like consent training and things of that sort. Basically trying to encourage people as much as possible to obtain consent, but perhaps carrying with that the connotation that as long as you get consent to a sexual interaction from another adult, the interaction is okay or morally permissible. So however you want to understand that, consent's going to be the main ingredient in permissible sexual interactions on this model. The main moral value that consent appeals to is respecting other people's autonomy. So the idea here is if two adults both exercise autonomy and want to engage in sexual activity, then there's nothing wrong with that. They should be perfectly allowed to go ahead. Now there might be unusual exceptions. McPherson doesn't bring this up, but there might be unusual exceptions if we're talking about people engaging in extremely dangerous or risky sexual behavior, or if we're talking about them engaging in sexual behavior that's affects others in certain ways. So say sex in a public place. I don't think that the consent-only model or the liberal sexual ethic would condone that, because in that case you'd be infringing on other people's autonomy, namely their ability to, conduct, themselves in that public space. So there's probably some limits to this that aren't being acknowledged. This essay is quite short, and so I think there are some caveats here to the liberal sexual ethic that in a longer paper should be flagged and mentioned. But anyway, another characteristic, there isn't anything special about sex. Wrongdoing in this context isn't any different than wrongdoing in other human interactions. So the idea is that sexual relationships are just one particular type of the broader class of human social interactions. So you can wrong people in social interactions in a wide range of different ways, but there's nothing unique about how you wrong people in sexual interactions. So all of the ways on this idea, all of the ways that you might harm somebody in a sexual relationship are going to be derivative from ways that you could harm people in relationships more generally. And the last thing is he says that this sexual ethic is a reductive account of sexual desire. It essentially reduces sexual desire to mere lust, looks at sexual desire through the same lens as what kind of animals have, right? Puts sexual desire in the same category as other basic carnal desires, like, say, thirst or hunger or perhaps certain other kinds of instincts, whether it was like to avoid pain or promote our pleasure or whatever. Lumps sexual desire into those categories and just reduces it to that kind of animalistic instinct. Now again, this is McPherson's take on what the liberal sexual ethic is. This is his representation of it. So what is so bad about the liberal sexual ethic according to McPherson? The basic problem is that it assumes or holds that there is such a thing as casual sex, which McPherson challenges in here. He cites, among other people, Elizabeth Anscombe as people who have suggested that these kinds of intimate physical interactions between human beings, there's nothing casual about them. They have a certain kind of intimacy to them that can't really be approached in a casual way. The main problem is that McPherson thinks this kind of understanding of sex is in some way dehumanizing. It removes sex from the sphere of personal relations and reduces people only to their physical body. So again, sex is being kind of placed in the same category as other sort of basic carnal desires. And so sexual desire on this model, at least the way McPherson kind of presents it, is sort of like just an attraction to someone else's body. And if you're willing to condone what he calls casual sex, or the viewing of sex as only, permissible sex as only requiring consent between two individuals, it almost becomes like a business transaction where two people are just interested in using the other person's body for their own pleasure. And he thinks that kind of dehumanizes the individuals involved, because it makes them seem, their personhood seem unimportant, right? It's just their physical bodies that really carry value in the context of that kind of relationship. So McPherson wants to say we should opt for what he calls the traditional sexual ethic, which he says is embodied by 3 virtues. Now, my reconstruction here was trickier than I was expecting, because the only one of these 3 virtues that he really talks about in the essay is chastity. There isn't even like a couple of sentences here or there to define modesty and fidelity, but the 3 he lists are chastity, modesty, and fidelity. Chastity, he says, kind of like sexual self-control. So, we've talked about virtue ethics in this class before. Virtues operate most of the time in this kind of being this midpoint, not a mathematical midpoint, but like some kind of midpoint between 2 behavioral extremes. So you can imagine a person who is too chaste, who basically never indulges in sexual pleasure, even with someone that they deeply love and care about. I think that the example in one of my discussion sections I used for this might be like Steve Carell's character in The 40-Year-Old Virgin, if you want a reference to not that old, though not super recent movie. Um, Steve Carell in that movie is so nervous about engaging in sexual interactions with this woman he's really into, that he just keeps putting it off and putting it off and putting it off, and she gets really frustrated because she's really attracted to him. And he won't just be honest that he's nervous because he's 40 years old and he's never had sex before and so on. That's probably an example of being too chaste, right? Having too much chastity. But on the other hand, the more common vice is probably the one where people do not exercise enough sexual self-control, right? Which on this model I would imagine means being too prone to give in to lustful desires, to perhaps be pushy or outright aggressive. I can imagine that vice being very likely to result in sexual assault, sexual violence, stalking, other kinds of predatory behaviors, right? If you can't control your sexual impulses. So the vice of having not enough chastity is probably the one we're more commonly familiar with. Now, modesty and fidelity doesn't say a lot about. Fidelity, I think we all have some understanding of. It's a kind of loyalty to one's spouse or girlfriend or whomever one is in a committed relationship with. If you the vice that we're probably more familiar with here is not having enough, right? So people who lack fidelity are people who are going to be prone to cheat on their partners, be dishonest in their relationships with them. That's going to be a recipe for those relationships failing or in other ways being unhealthy. But it is possible to have too much fidelity too, right? You could be engaged in a relationship that's not going well, and it might be in your interest and your partner's interest to get a divorce or otherwise break up. But there are some instances where people won't do that. They will stay loyal to their partner, perhaps beyond the point that it is psychologically healthy for both parties. Modesty was the one that I had the hardest time kind of thinking about what this probably meant, because again, McPherson says very little about modesty and fidelity in the essay. I suspect, my clinical gloss is that maybe it involves maintaining the proper amount of privacy and personal discretion when it comes to personal relationships. So not disclosing information that your partner doesn't want you to disclose, making sure to engage in intimate activities in appropriate places, making sure that you protect your and your partner's kind of deepest interests and important, private information or whatever. I'm not sure if that's actually how McPherson would understand it, but I'm doing the best I can based on what's in the text. The excess of that would obviously being immodest in that way would be kind of like, I imagine, a person who is either one of these TMI folks who discloses too much information about too many things. I definitely think that is something, as someone who was once a teenage man or a teenage boy, or however we want to understand that, a male gendered person, it is common for young men to demonstrate immodesty in their recollections of sexual encounters that they have, and it is often a way of, among certain groups of young men, of kind of establishing a certain kind of social status. But it seems to me that it's clearly not living up to like modesty as I've represented it here. I think that it's also possible, theoretically at least, to have too little modesty, to be kind of, I'm trying to think of an example of that being like sort of too private about your relationship. That might involve a level of maybe secrecy, or it might be overprotective of your partner, maybe, or it might just involve a level of secrecy that seems kind of unhealthy, or maybe it involves keeping information private or keeping the nature of your relationship private to the point that people who are important in your lives and probably ought to know about it, like maybe your really close friends or your parents, don't know about it. I'm not sure. But anyway, these are the three virtues that are associated with the traditional sexual ethic. And McPherson thinks that this kind of model, emphasizing these three virtues, can do a better job at capturing what's valuable about sexual relationships than the consent-only model or the liberal sexual ethic. Here's some other things he says about the traditional sexual ethic. One thing is, it views sexual relationships in some sense as being sacred or worthy of reverence. Because fidelity is one of those key virtues, it encourages monogamy. So this is an ethic according to which having one partner and being in a stable relationship is going to be highly valued. And it better accounts for the grave evil of sexual violence because it appeals to the violation of something sacred. So in other words, because sex is kind of this reverence-worthy thing, when you are violated in that context, it is particularly bad or evil. So he thinks that, the standard explanation on the consent-only model, and what he mentions Alan Goldman is saying in a different essay that he's engaging with, the consent-only model would say sexual violations are really bad because they involve a certain kind of serious physical harm to your body and a violation, as well as a violation of your personal autonomy and so on. And McPherson's just not sold that gets at what's really wrong about cases of sexual assault and the like. He thinks there's something more severe that's going on than just, oh, this is one instance, right? One instance of serious bodily harm. He thinks that there's more going on than just that there's a kind of vulnerability and humiliation associated with being sexually assaulted or being a victim of sexual violence that can only really be captured by invoking this idea of the sacred. The last thing he says about the traditional sexual ethic is that taboos that have traditionally been associated with this kind of ethical outlook are meant to protect what's best in human sexuality, namely erotic love and its vow. Now, to be fair to McPherson, he does mention there may be a need to update some of the traditional views associated with this kind of sexual ethic, right? He's not endorsing every single taboo over time that has been associated with this kind of position. He's not advocating that we go back to like the Victorian era, right, or anything like that, where we are, living an extremely repressive, in an extremely repressive society or something. So he wants to leave it open that we could reject some of these taboos, but he also thinks they're kind of important in some way because we want people to try to obtain stable, long-term erotic loving relationships because that, he doesn't use this language, but that's what's conducive to human flourishing. That's the context in which human sexuality reaches its apex, and that's the context in which people are going to be the happiest and the most satisfied. Now you might wonder here, is that true for everybody? Are there some people who may simply not want that kind of relationship, there are obviously people who pursue polyamorous relationships. There are people who don't pursue any relationships, people who are asexual and or aromantic. And there are also people who simply don't want to be tied down. They don't mind the idea of being in a relationship, but they don't want to be they don't want to be tethered to the same person for a really, really long time. That's probably one of the worries I would have about just this traditional sexual ethic, is like trying to put all of human sexuality into any one view seems like it's going to be very difficult. There are going to be some potential problems, but these are issues that probably go beyond the scope of this essay. Just kind of flagging them here because they are clear ways in which this traditional sexual ethic would be vulnerable to criticism that don't come up in the reading. So what's the upshot of all this? Well, McPherson thinks that universities are sort of failing in one of their main objectives. So according to him, sex-related training is problematic when it only emphasizes consent This training can't explain why sexual violence is so wrong, and thus, and this is his word, these are his words, it contributes to the problem that it's seeking to combat. So in other words, consent-only training about sexual ethics actually contributes to the problem of sexual violence because it encourages people to view sex as something that is almost analogous to like a business transaction, something that's not that big a deal, something that doesn't necessarily involve any kind of special sacred thing. He also says that placing sex in the same category as other consensual exchanges makes sex cheap and partners more easily discardable. So the idea is that if sex is widely available to you, and if it's viewed as, analogous to a business transaction of some sort, or a, consensual exchange of services between adults or whatever, then this makes sex seem less valuable to people, which means that finding a new sexual partner isn't as big a deal. And so people become more easily discardable, was a word that he used. The idea just being that it's easier for people to move from partner to partner. So he doesn't use this language, but in a way it almost sounds like he thinks that the consent-only model of sexual ethics is encouraging promiscuity. Now, at this point, I want to pause and just remind you all of something that has come up in our course a few times already and that I've been emphasizing throughout the course. We try, when we engage with opponents' points of view, we try to understand their views as charitably as we can, right? We follow a principle of charity in how we reason in this class. And I just wonder if if McPherson's reconstruction is really a charitable way of understanding consent training. I have done 4 of these trainings now at different universities. You have to do them now if you're a student, but you also have to do them if you're a faculty member, and at least some of the institutions, there's a lot of overlap between these different kinds of trainings. The vast majority of this consent training does not exist to push any kind of moral ideology. It exists in response to Title IX legislation. It exists because as students and faculty, we have certain obligations with respect to, if you're a student, your fellow peers that you're attending the university with, and if you're a professor or a staff member or administrator, you have certain responsibilities to look out for the welfare of your students and coworkers, to report violations of Title IX that you witness, and in general to just avoid creating a toxic workplace environment where sexism and abusive behavior and so on can propagate. So when I think about why do we have consent training, it's not to promote some kind of full throttle sexual ethic. It's mostly a matter of legal liability and what kind of campus and workplace culture we want to create. Another thing that came up in my discussion section where we covered part of this article, consent training looks like it's compatible with valuing long-term romantic relationships. There's a question here of whether or not, like McPherson views this liberal view of sexual ethics and his traditional view as being hostile to one another. But some of the folks I talked to were not convinced that was true and thought, well, you can care a lot about consent and think that that's a sort of prerequisite to having a permissible sexual interaction. But you can also think long-term romantic relationships are valuable and ideal and in many ways better than things like one-night stands or casual flings, or however we want to understand those short-term sexual encounters. But there's nothing about valuing consent that is incompatible with the idea of valuing long-term relationships. Whoops, come back to that in a second. The thing that I think is going on here, and you'll get this if you look at the footnotes closely to this paper, A great deal of McPherson's critique derives from how he interprets Alan Goldman's view from a well-anthologized article called Plain Sex. I just don't think that consent training in general necessarily endorses any of the views about sexuality that Goldman's putting forth there, or at least none of the consent training I've done at University of Tennessee, University of South Florida, Ohio State, and now University of Arizona. None of the consent training I've done seems to push the reductive view of human sexuality that Goldman is putting forward in that article. So I just think that this is a case where maybe McPherson's critique works as a direct response to Goldman, or at least makes a notable impact on Goldman's view. Maybe there's more to dig into there, but that's the way I would see McPherson's arguments as being most applicable. But I am just not sold that there is a direct connection between the arguments that he puts forward in this paper and actual consent training that takes place at universities. Again, most consent training is just a matter of kind of maintaining certain legal standards and making sure everybody understands the ways in which Title IX affects them in the workplace or as just a participant in campus life more generally. On that note, here's a graphic I have borrowed from some consent training tied into Title IX. I won't run through all of these, but Title IX is a big deal at universities, and schools take it very, very seriously. So the idea that we have training that emphasizes this legislation and that tries to promote the obtaining of consent in sexual interactions seems pretty valuable. The other thing that I would just point out to McPherson is we've got pretty good evidence that even if you want to promote all you want long-term monogamous relationships and, exercising proper sexual self-control, we just got really good empirical evidence that teenagers just don't do that. They're really bad at that. And so given that many of them will not exercise, the virtue of chastity and will not prioritize as teenagers long-term monogamous relationships, we need to give them some kind of guidance as to how they can engage in sexual interactions with other adults in ways that are respectful of those people's bodily integrity and personal autonomy. It just seems sort of like a requirement for avoiding various types of otherwise impermissible interactions. And there are still problems, of course. There are still cases of sexual assault on campus all across the country, but we providing this kind of training, universities are trying to do what they can to discourage it. I'm simply not sold that doing that is in some way an endorsement of casual sex or promiscuity or viewing sex only as a business transaction. I just don't think that's what's going on in consent training. And from a discussion I've had with some of you when we did the kind of consent training oriented exercise before I would have presented this material in class, I gather that many of you also did not find that the consent training was pushing any kind of hidden agenda about sexual ethics. So I'll leave it here and leave you all to think about the merits of the sort of traditional view of sexual ethics and the virtues that McPherson talked about. And I'll see you all next time.